Beneath the murky, slow-moving currents of the Green River in the summer of 1982, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. The water, choked with debris and shaded by heavy timber, surrendered the remains of 3 young women in a span of 5 days. There were no witnesses, no immediate suspects, and no obvious murder weapons left behind. The only certainty was that a highly organized predator was operating just south of Seattle, utilizing the dense, isolated banks of the river as a dumping ground. Investigators arriving at the muddy embankments faced a forensic nightmare. The bodies had been subjected to the elements, water degradation, and animal scavenging, stripping away the fragile trace evidence that typically anchors a homicide investigation. Detectives scoured the brush for fibers, tire tracks, or fingerprints, but the river had washed away much of the story. What remained were microscopic biological traces, invisible to the naked eye, silently waiting for science to catch up to the killer. The King County Police Department rapidly assembled a specialized task force to hunt the phantom they dubbed the Green River Killer. The sheer volume of missing persons reports and potential suspect tips overwhelmed the rudimentary filing systems of the era. Detectives chased tens of thousands of leads, interviewing anyone who had contact with the victims, many of whom were vulnerable sex workers operating along the Pacific Highway South Corridor. Among the thousands of men questioned was a commercial truck painter named Gary Ridgway. He first appeared on the task force radar in 1983 and again in 1984 after being linked to the last known whereabouts of several victims. He passed a polygraph test, offered plausible denials, and maintained a cooperative demeanor. Without physical proof tying him to the victims, investigators lacked the probable cause necessary to make an arrest, forcing them to release him back into the community. The frustrating reality of 1980s forensic science severely limited the task force. At the time, the gold standard for biological evidence was ABO blood typing, a method that could only narrow a suspect pool down to millions of individuals by identifying basic blood groups and secretor status. The concept of DNA profiling was still in its infancy, confined to academic research and entirely untested in criminal courts. Investigators knew they had a serial killer, but they lacked the technological lens required to see him. Despite these limitations, the medical examiners and crime scene technicians made a visionary decision. During the autopsies of victims like Marcia Chapman and Opal Mills, pathologists carefully collected seminal fluid swabs. They dried these samples, sealed them in sterile containers, and placed them into deep freeze storage. They did not know exactly how this evidence would be used in the future, but they understood that preserving it was their only hope against time. To ensure these samples would be admissible in a future courtroom, investigators meticulously maintained the chain of custody. This legal and procedural mandate requires a chronological, unbroken paper trail documenting the seizure, custody, control, transfer, and analysis of physical evidence. Every time a freezer door was opened, every time a vial was moved to a new facility, a signature and timestamp were recorded. If this chain were broken, a defense attorney could argue the evidence had been tampered with, rendering it inadmissible. This strict adherence to protocol would prove to be the most critical administrative action in the history of the King County Task Force. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the active killings appeared to stop, and the Green River Killer case slowly went cold. The task force was downsized, files were boxed up, and the terror that had gripped the Pacific Northwest settled into a chronic, lingering grief. Yet, inside the evidence lockers, the frozen swabs remained perfectly intact, a microscopic time capsule holding the identity of America's most prolific serial murderer. The landscape of criminal investigation fundamentally transformed by the turn of the millennium. The evolution of DNA forensics moved from rudimentary matching to highly sophisticated molecular analysis. Scientists developed polymerase chain reaction, a technique utilizing thermal cycling to amplify minute, degraded DNA samples into testable quantities. By 2001, the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory possessed the technology to extract a definitive genetic fingerprint from the ghosts of the Green River. Armed with this new scientific capability, cold case detectives reopened the frozen archives. Detective Tom Jensen, the last original member of the task force, requested that the state lab re-examine the seminal swabs collected nearly 2 decades prior. The request was a gamble, as extracting DNA from 20-year-old evidence was fraught with the risk of contamination or failure due to cellular degradation. Forensic scientists targeted short tandem repeats within the genetic material. These are specific sequences of DNA that vary wildly from person to person, creating a highly unique profile. The lab successfully extracted a clean DNA profile from the semen found on 3 of the early victims. The next step was to compare this profile against the thousands of suspect samples collected over the years, including a piece of gauze used to collect a saliva sample from a truck painter in 1987. In September 2001, the laboratory computers completed their comparative analysis. The genetic markers from the victims' swabs aligned perfectly with the saliva sample taken from Gary Ridgway 14 years earlier. According to the forensic report, the statistical probability of a random match was 1 in tens of billions. The science had finally pierced the veil of the killer's plausible deniability. On November 30th, 2001, King County authorities arrested Gary Ridgway as he left his job in Renton, Washington. The man who had evaded capture for nearly 20 years was quietly taken into custody, stripped of his freedom by a microscopic sequence of nucleic acids. The arrest sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, proving that no case was truly dead as long as biological evidence survived. However, the initial DNA match only linked Ridgway to a handful of the dozens of victims. To build a comprehensive case, investigators needed to connect him to the skeletal remains discovered in remote wooded areas years after the murders. Traditional nuclear DNA analysis, which requires relatively intact cells, frequently fails on bones that have been exposed to harsh environmental conditions for decades. To bridge this evidentiary gap, the laboratory turned to mitochondrial DNA analysis. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is inherited from both parents and exists in a single copy within the cell nucleus, mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from the mother and exists in hundreds of copies within the cell's energy-producing structures. This high copy number makes it far more resilient to environmental degradation, allowing scientists to extract genetic profiles from ancient bones, teeth, and hair shafts. Forensic analysts applied this technique to a strand of hair found on the remains of a victim discovered in 1984. The mitochondrial profile extracted from the hair shaft matched the maternal lineage of Gary Ridgway. While mitochondrial DNA cannot identify an individual with the absolute certainty of nuclear DNA, it is a powerful exclusionary tool. Combined with the nuclear DNA matches and circumstantial evidence, the forensic net surrounding the suspect tightened into an inescapable knot. Facing a mountain of irrefutable biological evidence, the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office navigated a complex legal and moral dilemma. They possessed the evidence to secure a death penalty conviction for a few murders, but dozens of families remained without answers, their daughters' bodies still hidden in the dense Washington wilderness. The prosecutors opted for a controversial strategy, prioritizing the recovery of remains over the ultimate penal sanction. In 2003, a historic plea agreement was drafted. The state agreed to take the death penalty off the table. In exchange, Gary Ridgway had to provide a full, truthful confession to every murder he committed in King County and lead investigators to the undiscovered remains of his victims. If he lied or withheld information, the agreement would be voided and he would face execution. The legal precedent set by this plea agreement sparked intense debate among legal scholars regarding the ethics of trading the death penalty for information. During months of grueling interviews, the man behind the Green River Killer moniker detailed his modus operandi. This term refers to the characteristic method of operation a criminal uses to execute their crimes. Ridgway calmly explained how he exploited the vulnerability of his victims, using photographs of his own son to disarm them before strangling them. His clinical, detached recounting of the murders, including his habit of returning to the dumping sites, provided a chilling psychological portrait of a prolific predator. Following the terms of the plea deal, investigators transported the serial killer back into the wilderness. Heavily guarded and shackled, he directed detectives to overgrown ravines and forgotten logging roads. The search teams employed forensic anthropology techniques, carefully excavating the sites to recover fragile skeletal fragments that had been hidden under decades of soil and vegetation. At these new recovery sites, investigators also relied on forensic entomology, the study of insects in criminal investigations. By analyzing the remnants of insect casings found near the newly discovered bones, scientists could corroborate Ridgway's timeline of when the bodies were deposited. The convergence of DNA profiling, anthropological excavation, and insect analysis created a watertight verification of his confessions. On December 18, 2003, the legal culmination of the decades-long investigation took place in a heavily secured Seattle courtroom. Gary Ridgway stood before the judge and formally pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Court records indicate it was the largest number of murder convictions for a single individual in United States history, a staggering statistical testament to the scale of his crimes. The sentencing hearing provided a platform for the families of the victims to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. Relatives delivered agonizing victim impact statements, expressing decades of pent-up rage, sorrow, and in a few rare instances, forgiveness. The sterile, objective nature of the forensic evidence that brought him to justice stood in stark contrast to the profound human devastation displayed in the courtroom. The judge sentenced the defendant to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for tampering with evidence for each victim. The gavel fall marked the official end of the Green River Killer's reign. The case was officially closed, not by a sudden eyewitness account or a dramatic chase, but by the slow, methodical triumph of the scientific method over human deception. Beyond the immediate closure for the families, the resolution of this case fundamentally altered the trajectory of American law enforcement. The triumph of the King County Task Force demonstrated the absolute necessity of retaining biological evidence indefinitely. Police departments across the nation overhauled their evidence storage protocols, recognizing that a seemingly useless swab today could be the key to a conviction 20 years from now. The case also accelerated the funding and development of national DNA databases. The success of matching an old suspect sample to cold case crime scene evidence proved the efficacy of cross-referencing genetic profiles on a massive scale. The combined DNA index system, managed by the FBI, expanded rapidly in the wake of the conviction, becoming a standard tool for investigators tackling unsolved homicides worldwide. The decades-long hunt for the Green River Killer stands as a definitive testament to how DNA forensics solved decades of murders. A predator who exploited the shadows of society and the limitations of early investigative techniques was ultimately undone by the microscopic evidence he left behind. The meticulous preservation of the past, combined with the technological innovations of the future, ensured that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually be brought into the light.